This is not going to be a comprehensive study of all civil unrest in London. That's obviously rather a large subject. It'll just be a look at 8 mostly historical episodes, which fit into a manageable itinerary from the Tower of London to Trafalgar Square, with a passing look at 2 more episodes away from our route, at Cable Street in 1936 and Tottenham in 2011. So we won't be looking at more modern riots such as Notting Hill, Brixton or Broadwater Farm. Also, the riots we're going to be looking at happen to be more political than social for the most part. And apart from a glance over our shoulders at the 2011 riots, these riots we're looking at don't usually have elements of tension between different communities, nor between those communities and the authorities. Also, just to warn you, we will be looking at the episodes as they arise on our itinerary. So this was set out as a walk, and I can really recommend the walk. I really enjoy doing it, and it's a surprisingly much shorter walk than you might think. So they don't come up in the chronological order they took place, although fortuitously the first disorder we'll look at happens to be the first place we'll visit. And of course the whole presentation is ended at each end. We start and begin with protests against poll taxes, and right at the end we'll take stock and see if the authorities have actually learned anything over the 6.5 centuries since the first poll tax disorders in 1381. So before we get started, if you have a map handy, you may find that a big benefit. A lot of people actually enjoy following the route on a map. Oh, sorry, ignore the briefing material, that's not been sent. And a big thank you straight away for Google Earth for what you'll be seeing. Okay, well, we get started and we go to Tower Hill Station, and we come out of Tower Hill and we walk up in front of it to the viewing platform, which is above the ticket office. And this is the view we get of the viewing platform at the Tower of London at East Smithfield. And we're looking obviously at the tower, and this is a lovely panoramic view of it. Again, if you're ever in that part of London, it's worth a detour just to take in that view. Now we'll talk about the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. And there's going to be a part 1 and a part 2 of this, and as you'll see. The revolt was occasioned by the imposition of a new poll tax, and it spread right across southern England. It was provoked by the economy already being in recession, and then the great resentment was the suspicion that the new revenue to be levied by the poll tax would simply go to support the extravagant lifestyles of Richard II's family and favourites, especially Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt. Well, it's called the Peasants' Revolt. Very few of the rebels were in fact peasants. Most of them were tradesmen or professionals, and they wanted the government to lift its heavy and corrupt hand from them. Well, the rebels enjoyed early success everywhere and marched on London under leaders like Wat Tyler, John Ball and Jack Straw, and they effectively took over the city, but the Tower of London actually held out against them. The 14-year-old King Richard decided to confront the rebels, and there was a showdown at Mile End on the 13th of June 1381. Richard did face them down, and he also appeared there to concede to most of their demands, but after that had happened, a scuffle broke out in which Wat Tyler was stabbed and wounded, and he was then taken to Bart's Hospital. Now let's have a look at the Tower of London and what's going on there. This is a 15th century picture of the Tower of London. It's rather fanciful, but it's as near as we can get to what would have been seen on the day. And this is what's going on inside the tower. Now, what happened in the build-up to this was that a group of the rebels, while Richard II was talking to them in Mile End, a group of the rebels left the main body and went to the tower. They then told the guards that Richard had said they could enter, and incredibly the guards then just let them in. Once inside the tower, they carried out their mission of hunting down and killing any of the king's ministers they could find. They found and killed Simon Sudbury, the Bishop of London and Lord Chancellor, and Sir Robert Hales, the Lord High Treasurer. Now, hiding in a trunk in a room that's probably behind one of the walls you can see, was a boy who was then titled the Earl of Derby. He was John of Gaunt's son. He was not found, and he survived the invasion of the tower. Now, this boy went on to become the Earl of Bolingbroke, and then Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2. Had he been killed in 1381, English history might have taken a very different course. So that's the first episode we're going to look at, that attack on the Tower of London in 1381. And we'll pick it up again at the Savoy Palace later on in the walk. Now we leave the Tower of London, we turn around and walk north through a little sort of maze of alleyways. And don't worry too much if you get lost here. We are walking along Cooper's Row, but en route, you do want to have a look at this. This is a magnificent piece of the Roman wall of London, which was also the medieval wall. It's in the courtyard of the Leonardo Royal Hotel. Then we press on to a road called the Crooked Friars, and was actually a statue of the crutched friars. There's actually a statue of friars holding crutches to make sure you know where you are. And then we walk into a street called Drury Street, and we come up to Aldgate. Now at Aldgate, if you are able to keep track of it, we come into a slightly wider, larger area, and we have on the left here the medieval actual Aldgate, the city gateway. Now the most famous resident at Aldgate was Geoffrey Chaucer, who actually had a suite of apartments in the gatehouse. And then on the right, we can see the layout. Now the gateway was across the road here, and that church is St Botolph without the gateway. And we've come in on the right-hand side, and we're going to walk out of this picture heading due west on Leadenhall Street, where we're going to reach our next event, but not before I've done a diversion off-piste to the east, about a mile east, to talk about the Battle of Cable Street. Now, the reason I'm talking about Cable Street is that it's essential for the understanding of modern policing and how demonstrations are handled. But it's a remarkable story in its own right for those who don't already know it. It took place in 1936, and the battle the origin of the battle was the desire of the British Union of Fascists under Oswald Mosley to emulate the success of the Nazis in Germany and seize control of the streets. Now in Germany, the Nazi Party had put its members into uniforms, gone onto the streets, and won a near civil war with the communists. And this meant they were able to control the streets, deal with their enemies, and intimidate the populace at large. And their prime enemy at this stage was firstly the communists, but then after that, it became the Jews. Now Mosley put his British fascists into uniform and started to establish a presence on British streets. And in 1936, he decided to combine this with an attack on what he thought was a hated alien community, the Jews in the east of London. And the plan was to march into the heart of a Jewish area in Cable Street, attack people and property, and strike up support from a local non-Jewish community. Well, this was a large and ambitious operation, and both the police and opponents of the march had plenty of time to prepare for it. Thousands of police were drafted in to try and keep the fascists and their opponents apart, and all the local residents of whatever background united to oppose the march and turned out in the streets to block the fascists. And this, of course, came as a very unpleasant surprise for Mosley, who'd been counting on local support. The police, in turn, did a good job, preventing more violence, as you can see here, and eventually the fascists gave up and withdrew. Now, the next day, the press hailed the march as a triumph for the fascists, and that they had enlisted the police to protect them. Well, not for the first or last time, the press had got this completely wrong. The fascists had been deeply disheartened by the experience and actually never tried to march in the East End again. But much, much more damaging for them was that the government rushed through the Public Order Act 1936, and this act still governs how protests can be conducted and policed. Its single most important provision was to ban the wearing of uniforms at political demonstrations and rallies. So at a stroke, Moses' strongest weapon was snatched away from him, and he had never hoped to copy those Nazi tactics. We're now going to move on to the evil May Day riots in 1517. And this is the first disorder that specifically targets foreigners, not any particular ethnic group, but just anybody who is foreign. We walk along Leadenhall, heading west, and we've reached Leadenhall Market, which is just south of Leadenhall Street here. Now, this is Leadenhall Market today, and it's absolutely magnificent. If you haven't been into it, you have really missed the trick. It's a symphony of colour and cast iron and glass. It's a wonderful restored Victorian building. The original market was built in the early 15th century and almost certainly was a corn market. Now, this is what was happening on the evening of the 1st of May 1517 at Leadenhall Market. May Day was a festival, but the fun soon degenerated into a riot, and the rioters' target was bankers from Lombardy and migrant workers from Flanders, who they accused of undermining the economy and stealing Londoners' jobs. Now, the build-up to this was for several weeks. Rabble-rousing preachers at St Paul's Cross, which we'll be looking at shortly, had been inciting these xenophobic attacks. The Lord Mayor of London tried to enforce a curfew, but he simply did not have the law and order resources to enforce it, so the authorities immediately looked weak and incompetent. The rioters took over the streets as evening wore on into the night, and the rioting actually lasted right through to the 3rd of May. There was a lot of looting and arson against any property thought to be owned by foreigners. Now, the Lord Mayor made matters even worse by suggesting that the troops in the Tower of London should open fire on the rioters with their artillery. Now, the most famous incident in the riots is about this man. This is Thomas More. And on the first evening, he was one of the under-sheriffs of London, and he was a young lawyer, and he, quite by chance, walked into a group of the rioters, and he single-handedly faced them down and persuaded them to disband and go home. And this absolutely made his reputation. Without this incident, he might have had a much more modest career. As for the riot itself, More's heroism didn't actually make much difference. It ran on to the 3rd of May, and on the 3rd of May, the Duke of Norfolk brought a private army of 1,300 retainers into London to restore order, and then more royal troops started arriving on the 4th of May. Now, we leave the evil May Day riots, we continue along Leadenhall, and we're heading west. We've crossed over into a road called Cornhill, and we're still heading west. And we're going to reach the Royal Exchange and the Bank of England, and particularly the spaces and alleyways around them. And this is the scene of the G20 protests in 2009, and that's historically the most recent protest we'll actually visit. And it's also the scene of the Gordon riots in 1780, but we'll do the G20 protests first. Now, they took place on the 1st and 2nd of April 2009. And this is a picture of the protests outside the Bank of England, and they continued on the 1st and then the 2nd of April. The demonstrators also filled all the alleyways of Cornhill. It was largely peaceful, and it was a protest against globalization and against world poverty. The major incident that made the riot really famous, or protest really famous, was that an elderly and chronically ill newspaper seller called Ian Tomlinson took a wrong turning on his way home and ran into a group of policemen in one of the alleyways off Cornhill. He was hit by one of them, Simon Harwood, and pushed to the ground, and he later died of the injuries he sustained. Harwood was prosecuted for manslaughter but later acquitted. It emerged, though, that Harwood had been judged psychologically unfit to undertake crowd control duties, but had managed to join the police there by subterfuge. And there's an extraordinary parallel with what's going on today, with the death of George Floyd on the 25th of May 2020 in Minneapolis, because the policeman in Minneapolis, who is alleged to have murdered George Floyd, had also been judged psychologically unfit to undertake crowd control duties. So some lessons aren't learned over the years. So here is what the police did in response to these protests, and here is what Ian Tomlinson would have seen as he made his unsteady way home on the wrong route. Right, well, we're in the same area, and we're going to go back 239 years to look at what was happening in 1780. And we find the spaces all outside and around the Bank of England before by rioters in the Gordon riots. Here we see on the left a contemporary picture of the riots. In fact, the Bank of England wasn't burnt down, and I'll explain more what happened in a minute. But this illustrates the size and ferocity of the crowds there. Right, well, let's talk a bit more about the Gordon riots. They were the most serious breakdown of law and order since the Peasants' Revolt, and they were occasioned by opposition to the Papist Act of 1778, which had been the first small step towards giving Roman Catholics full civil rights. Now, Lord George Gordon, after whom the riots are named, was a Scottish nobleman, but not a peer, and he was sitting in 1780 as a member of the House of Commons. There was great opposition to Catholic emancipation, and Gordon saw a chance to make mischief and make his mark with it. In 1779, he formed what was called the Protestant Association, which aimed to have the Act repealed. He organised a mass rally on the 2nd of June 1780 to march from St George's Fields, which is south of the river near Elephant and Castle, up to Westminster to lobby for the repeal of the Act. Now, 1780 was also in the middle of the War of American Independence. This was deeply unpopular in Britain and divided opinion in the same way that, for example, the Suez Crisis or the Second Gulf War did. Gordon, along with many other MPs, actually supported American independence and also wanted an end to an expensive war with no prospect of victory in sight. Well, 50,000 people arrived in Parliament Square with Gordon at their head, and then it all went horribly wrong. While Gordon didn't exactly lead or incite the mob, he did nothing to control it, and the mob started to attack Catholic and foreign institutions. This began with targeting Catholic embassies and their chapels. It rapidly lost its focus and became an attack on any public buildings or the homes of the rich, and with a lot of looting and arson. And one of the first targets was Newgate Prison, where all the inmates were freed to join the rioters. And the riots lasted for nearly a week and reached as far afield as Kenwood House in Hampstead. During that week, the authorities did absolutely nothing. They neither mobilised what few police there were, nor did anyone, and this is in quotes, read the Riot Act, end quote. And doing that would instantly have criminalised the rioters, and it was very often an effective deterrent in its own right and led to mobs dispersing. Finally, of course, the regular army had to be called in for the only time in London's history, and on the 7th of June they had orders to clear the streets and shoot rioters on sight, and up to 450 people were gunned down in the streets to restore order. The aftermath of this was that Gordon was tried for treason, but was acquitted in 1781. Meanwhile, the Lord Mayor was fined £1,000 for dereliction of duty. This was a massive sum for the time. The desire for a proper police force to be available ahead of the sort of trouble breaking out also began to gain serious ground. As a little aside here, though, that the French were insufferably smug over this and gloated over Britain's discomfiture. They lost no opportunity to say that such events could never happen in Paris. But I'll leave you to guess who had the last laugh on that one. Now, the scene on the left shows the rioters besieging the Bank of England on the 7th of June, but the staff in the bank, supported by local residents, acted as a militia and formed an effective garrison and held the rioters off, so the bank wasn't in fact captured. And then later on the 7th, as you'll see on the picture on the right, the regular army moved in and shot dead anyone remaining on the streets. One of the consequences of this for the Bank of England itself is that when it was rebuilt in the early 19th century, the brief was to make it much more of a fortress, which is why it looks that way today. Now, we leave the Bank of England and we keep heading westwards. And we walk due west to take roads called Poultry and then Cheapside. So that's the entry to Poultry, and this is Cheapside. Now, cheap simply means market. And the thing to note in Cheapside, which relates to law and order, is this building here, magnificent Wren Church. And this is St Mary le Bow. Up here, you've got the Bow Bells, famous nursery rhymes, etc., etc. But the point about the bells is they were the curfew bells for London, and they were tolled mid-evening and at dawn each day to signal the closing and reopening of the city's gates. It's also why anyone born within earshot of the bells is held to be a true Londoner or a Cockney. Now, at the western end of Cheapside, we dodge round behind that bus to enter St Paul's Churchyard. And here's an old picture of St Paul's Churchyard with the medieval cathedral before it burned down in 1666. And here we see a preacher addressing a rabble. Now, this is the same scene today. Now, this is the cross which is restored, or not a replica, but this was built in the early 20th century. Now, the point about St Paul's Cross was it was where rabble-rousing preachers could preach, and we've heard that they incited xenophobic attacks in 1517. And the cross was like an early version of Speaker's Corner, where anyone could preach, but it had a reputation for fiery speakers seeking to make mischief. And it has a relevance for the next episode of Civil Disorder we'll look at, the Earl of Essex's rebellion in 1601. And that relevance is that he tried to get to the cross specifically to incite the London mob he thought he'd find there to join him in his rebellion. The original cross was destroyed in the Commonwealth period because it was seen as a threat to law and order, and assemblies there were forbidden. Now, we'll move on to look at the next rebellion, but before we do this, to do better justice to it, we're going to use the magic of Zoom, and I will teleport you all half a mile from St Paul's Cross, which was the destination for this riot, to Essex House at the far eastern end of the Strand, which is where it started. And this means that you'll be able to retrace Essex's steps in the right order. So this is Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was Elizabeth I's last favourite, and this episode is all about what he did in 1600 and 1601. And we start at Essex House. Essex House, the scene from the river, is this building here, and the Strand runs behind the building there. And this is what's on the site today. It's for Devereux Arms, and after a couple of walks in previous happier years, we have actually ended up having a pint of beer there and relaxing. Now, to set the scene, all this takes place where the City of London meets the City of Westminster, and that boundary is was marked by this structure, Temple Bar. That's been replaced by a big brass statue of a dragon now. And this is the original Temple Bar. The one you're seeing was built by Sir Christopher Wren in the 17th century, but it goes right back to the Middle Ages. Today, just for completion, it's here outside St Paul's, and it was re-erected here. It was rescued from dereliction and re-erected here as a Millennium Project. Now, looking through Temple Bar in the original picture, you can see along Fleet Street towards where St Paul's Cathedral is, just the other side of Ludgate Hill. Today, if you're trying to get your bearings, what's happening here is the Royal Courts of Justice. Now, we walk, we'll follow the route of it, but about midday on the 8th of February, Essex led 200 armed supporters out of Essex House and along Fleet Street towards St Paul's Cathedral, where he was going to attempt to rouse a much larger group of people to rebel against Queen Elizabeth I. And his plan was to take control of the government and dismiss the Queen's ministers, Sir Robert Cecil above all, and become the power behind the throne in his stead. Now, he was a desperate man, and this does appear to be a really desperate episode, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But it was very much the last throw of the dice for him. And it had come to this after his failure as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland to defeat Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. He'd rebelled against English rule and made quite a success of his rebellion. Essex led a very incompetent campaign which ground to a halt in 1600, and he then defied royal orders to return to London to see the Queen. In the circumstances, this of itself amounted to treason, but Essex thought he could charm the Queen into forgiving him and letting him make a new start. He made the most appalling mistake. He burst into her chambers while she was still at her toilette. And this was such a misjudgment because she had not yet had her makeup applied to cover her by now dreadful complexion, nor her wig fitted to hide the fact that she was bald. This wasn't just female vanity. This was about preserving the integrity of the public image of the monarchy. As a result, Essex was immediately banished from the court and told to expect criminal charges. He was tried and found guilty later in 1600, and he suffered the loss of all his public offices and all his trading privileges, and therefore all his income. But he plotted to restore his position and gathered a group of people around him who were also dissatisfied with the way Elizabeth was ruling the country and worried about what the succession might be when she died. So he fortified Essex House and began storing arms there. By February 1601, it had become an arsenal and able to hold hundreds of armed men. Unfortunately for Essex, many of the men who were in there with him were also government informers, and the government knew in advance of every move he would make. So this is the route on the right. We come up to Ludgate Hill, and this is the original Ludgate. This is the actual structure that he and his followers would have seen in 1601. And there's St Paul's Cathedral behind it. So Ludgate itself stood across that bit of the road, and just behind it is another Wren church, which is just within, it's called, because it's within the gates. So Essex's followers followed that route. Once they were through Ludgate, however, they discovered a trap had been sprung. The government, of course, knew all about the plot, and they had moved troops into the Ludgate area. And as soon as Essex's men were inside the gate, it was closed behind them. The troops invited them to surrender. Most realised the game was up and did surrender, and most were later just fined not very much or pardoned. But a few, led by Essex, were not ready to give up. They could no longer reach St Paul's Cross, which is, just get your bearings, at the other side of St Paul's Cathedral. It's way over there, a quarter of a mile off in that direction. They could no longer reach St Paul's Cross, but some of them then broke free and went down to the river and got back to Essex House by boat. They then dug in for a siege and awaited developments. The development was that the government troops brought artillery from the Tower of London and threatened to blow Essex House apart unless Essex surrendered. And by the end of the evening, it was all over and they didn't have to use the cannons. Now, I'm going to leave you with this lovely picture of Errol Flynn and Bette Davies from the Hollywood 1939 Weepy, The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, where I tell you about the aftermath. Essex was arrested, tried, convicted of treason and executed. Scores of others were arrested and prosecuted, but almost all received either fines or pardons. Now, if we jump forward 4 years to 1605, we find that James Stuart, as James I, is on the throne, and he is in mortal peril from the gunpowder plot. Again, in the aftermath of that plot, hundreds of people were arrested and questioned. What immediately struck the authorities was how many people arrested in 1605 had also been with Essex in 1601 and been arrested and questioned then as well. This suggests there might be more to Essex's rebellion than first meets the eye. It just might have been part of a much larger plan to prevent James Stuart from acceding to the English throne. If Essex had succeeded, and Elizabeth had still died in 1603, then might Essex have engineered the succession of Arbella Stuart, the next in line to the throne after James, and sought to dominate and rule through her. It's all pure speculation, but I hope you enjoy letting your imaginations range over the possibilities of what otherwise seems a really pretty inexplicable episode. Okay, well, we now zoom back, and I hope we don't get too seasick doing this, to where we've just left off, and this is the Strand with Essex House just off to our left on the picture on the left. Now, we're in the Strand and we walk past this church here, St Clement Danes. It's called Danes because it was a church built for Vikings to worship in. And then we continue on the Strand till we get to this church here, which is St Mary le Strand, and that's where we'll talk about the next riot. Now, St Mary le Strand stood at the southern end of Drury Lane. It doesn't now, but it did at the time of the riot in 1809. And today it's truncated by the Aldwych development. You can see it here. And Drury Lane stops short a couple of 100 yards north of there. And the picture on the left, however, takes us back to what the cityscape was in 1809. Here we are in Drury Lane at the top of the slope, looking down on a scenically foggy day. And that church spire there is this church spire here, at Mary le Strand. And we're also, quite by chance, looking down the road, we've got our backs to the Royal Opera House, which is the point of the whole episode. And the episode is what's called the Old Price Riots. And they are the most implausible episode of civil unrest we're going to look at, because they were all about the price of seats at the opera. And these are the pictures of the Royal Opera House. And that's obviously the outside, and this is the inside. And the picture on the right here explains exactly what happened and why the riot took place. If you look closely at the bottom, you'll see an area reserved for standing. And this is called the stalls. And the stalls were replaced by the owners of the Opera House by expensive seating. And that priced the local population out of enjoying their night at the opera. And they protested. And here we see the protest taking place. This is a political cartoon of the day, and this cartoon actually shows thugs hired by the owners of the Opera House attacking the protesters. And this riot has the distinction of being the longest running continuous civil disturbance anywhere in Britain. It lasted for 3 months, day after day after day, starting in September 1809, and more than 20 people were killed in the disorders around the Opera House. At the end of those 3 months, the owners eventually backed down and reinstated the standing area. The long-term effect was actually to add pressure to create a proper police force, and that would happen 20 years later, and is linked to our next site, although not actually to our next riot. So for our next site, we don't have to actually move from St Mary le because we can just glance north and take in what's going on there. And we're looking at Bow Street, which runs parallel to Drury Lane, and Bow Street Police Station. Now, the reason this has a link with policing is that it's the home of the Bow Street Runners. No coincidence, that's what they're called. And the Bow Street Runners were the direct precursors of the modern Metropolitan Police Force that was founded in 1829. And so this riot is actually the first confrontation we've got between protesters and the modern Metropolitan Police Force. However, the actual riot started a bit to the south on the Strand where it meets Aldwych. And this is actually where it started. This was a place called the Eagle Hut, which was provided by the YMCA for rest and refreshment facilities for demobilized US and Canadian servicemen. So don't forget, they're all coming back from the continent, and this is 1919. The armies are still being demobbed, and it's a huge job getting people back across the Atlantic, back into civilian life. Well, on the 19th of March, 1919, a large number of US and Canadian servicemen were gambling in the street outside the Eagle Hut, not knowing that gambling outside was illegal in the UK. The police from Bow Street Police Station were sent to stop the gambling. Scuffles broke out and the police were attacked. The police withdrew to the safety of the police station, but taking some prisoners with them. And one US serviceman who was arrested and taken to the police station was alleged to have been assaulted and killed by the police inside it. In fact, he wasn't, but the police refused to produce him or to give any account of their actions. An ever larger and angrier crowd gathered outside the police station to besiege it, and the situation grew ever tenser and scuffles and fighting broke out. Eventually, the police released the uninjured servicemen and the riot ended. There was a striking parallel with what happened in Tottenham in 2011 here, in that the police in Tottenham refused to give any account of why they had shot and killed Mark Duggan and what had actually taken place. And this had provoked the crowd outside Tottenham Police Station to move from anger to violence, and London-wide rioting eventually ensued from that. Now, to reach our next riot, we need to carry on along the Strand, and over to our left here is the road that goes across Waterloo Bridge, and we're going across straight on towards Trafalgar Square. And we're now going to rejoin the Peasants' Revolt for phase 2 of it. And this is the Savoy Hotel, where sadly we can't on this occasion stop off either for a cup of tea or a cocktail or whatever else might take your fancy. Now, it's called the Savoy Hotel because it's on the site of the Savoy Palace. And the Savoy Palace was so called because it had been granted to Henry III's Queen, Henry III's Queen's uncle, and that family was from Savoy. And the uncle moved to Palace to be near his niece, and he moved to London to be near his niece and was granted a palace. The palace building stayed with the royal family and eventually passed to John of Gaunt. And we've met him before. He had it embellished and encrusted with semi-precious stones. And the suspicion had been that the poll tax was being used to pay for these sorts of materials to maintain a really flamboyant lifestyle. The palace itself became a hated symbol of royal extravagance and exploitation. And the rebels seized the palace, and they then set about destroying it, not rapidly, but piece by piece. They first of all prized all the jewels out of the walls and smashed each one rather than being accused of being looters. They then set about demolishing the palace literally brick by brick. But before they could do that, they accidentally ignited a gunpowder store in the basement and blew the building apart. Now, that's the Savoy Palace, looking at it from the river, and you'll see it's a magnificent building and with wonderful facades. And it was, say, a really very important building in London at the time. And here we have John of Gaunt and Wat Tyler meeting up again. On the left, we have John of Gaunt. And on the right, we actually have the scene we talked about earlier at Mile End, And this is Wat Tyler being stabbed at Mile End, after which he was taken to Berks Hospital. But the revolt ended the day after the events at Mile End and after the Savoy Palace had been destroyed. And what ended the revolt was that Wat Tyler was dragged from his hospital bed at Berks and stabbed to death in Smithfield with a dagger which is still proudly on display in the Fishmonger's Hall. After that, the revolt fizzled out. It was a long mopping up exercise while the government regained control of all the territory the revolt had held, and there were show trials and public executions. The revolt actually achieved none of its aims and left no legacy, but it was still nonetheless a real shock to the political system. Now, we'll continue along the Strand towards Trafalgar Square. And at Trafalgar Square, we turn north, turn right to go north, up to this portico here for St Martin's in the Fields. And whoops, and here is St Martin's in the Fields. And we go up these steps and look at, and this makes a magnificent viewing platform. And I'll show you what you see actually when you get there. And this is the view. Now, unfortunately, on the right-hand side, the day that Google Earth decided to photograph the view, somebody had put this, it's one of the statues on the pedestals in Trafalgar Square. But the point of that is it's slightly clearer for the layout. So there's Trafalgar Square, and that's Whitehall going off down there. Those distant towers are the Houses of Parliament. This is another view of Trafalgar Square, and you can see the open space in front of it, the roads coming in from the south, and the fact, of course, that there is the National Gallery, a row of buildings behind these people to the north. Now, the poll tax riot took place on 31st of March 1990. It's our last site, but it also has the distinction of being the only episode of civil disorder, but not only just achieved all its aims, but actually some more besides. Now, some of the older among you may actually remember the riot and seeing it on television on the day, but it actually wasn't obvious, even if you were living through it and watching the reporting of it, exactly what had happened or why. So I'll run through what happened that day. The riot took place against the background of bitter opposition to what was called the Community Charge, but was commonly known as the poll tax, and that was a deliberate reference back to the Peasants' Revolt. Like the Gordon riots, the day started with a huge rally in South London and then a march on Parliament. The protesters were directed by the police into Parliament Square and then directed from Parliament Square to continue up Whitehall with the hope that they would then disperse. Unfortunately, the police who had been stationed in Trafalgar Square thought they were under orders to kettle, that is to restrain and hold the crowd, in Trafalgar Square. And they were also unaware that their colleagues in Parliament Square were still directing thousands more people into that kettle. The Trafalgar Square became a pressure cooker that exploded. And this is the scene you would have seen from that viewing platform at St Martin's in the Fields. The protesters in Trafalgar Square improvised weapons and turned on the police. Out of the kettle and managed to get out to the north, and there they attacked what they called capitalist targets, such as restaurants, banks, and luxury shops. And this was the first time that disorder had led to this sort of targeted attacking and looting of these sorts of premises, and it set a pattern for future demonstrations. The riot brought huge discredit on the government and also on the police, and it made clear the level and intensity of opposition to the new tax and the threat to public order if it remained. In the short term, it led directly to the tax being abolished. In the longer term, it led to the challenge to Margaret Thatcher's leadership and her subsequent resignation. If you think of all the earlier riots we've seen where demands were made for policies to be changed or ministers to leave office, only this riot achieved both of those aims. So let's just think about the lessons we may have learned from this. When the authorities lose control, they never seem to get back on the right foot. And that happened all the way through, from the evil May Day riots through to the poll tax riot. And when the authorities misjudge the situation, that always seems to put them on the wrong foot, and they have really struggled to get back on top of it. But one theme that really came across to me is that when the authorities refuse to explain what they're doing or account for themselves, it always makes things get rapidly much worse. And you see this in the G20 protest, the Bow Street, Battle of Bow Street, and in Tottenham in 2011. But two examples of the authorities getting it absolutely right were Essex's rebellion and the Battle of Cable Street. Now, in happier times, we would now adjourn to St Martin's in the Fields Crypt Cafe. It is a really excellent venue. I can't recommend it too highly. And it's underneath where we were standing watching the poll tax riots. But a couple more like parish notices. Just do need to give some picture credits, which is to say that there are two main sources for the pictures here, Google Earth Street View and Wikipedia. And I'm very grateful for both of them, and that we can enjoy what they have to offer if we give them their proper acknowledgement. There are a couple of other more random pictures that are mostly posted on the internet by tourists or local enthusiasts, and a big thank you for them as well. And finally, of course, a couple of pictures are straightforward advertising and promotional material designed to encourage you to visit the building, the restaurant, whatever concerned. And another little notice, if you enjoyed this, bear in mind the event was free to attend, but any donations to support the programmes you can find on the York Unlimited website will be hugely welcome. And this is the link for you, and I'll leave that up for a moment, or Kyla can give it to you again, maybe circulate it separately, but you shouldn't have any trouble finding it if you go into the University of York website, input York Unlimited, and it will tell you what sort of programmes you can donate to. And finally, we have reached the end of our 2-mile walk, and it is only 2 miles. And I am very happy to answer any questions. I will stop screen sharing.